March 1971, Madison Square Garden. Joe Frazier and Muhammad Ali are about to fight for the heavyweight championship of the world. Courtside seats cost more than most people in Harlem make in a year. The crowd is a parade of money and fame. Sinatra is there with a camera. Burt Lancaster is doing color commentary. And somewhere in the first few rows, a man nobody in that building should recognize sits down in a floor-length chinchilla coat with a matching hat. He is not a boxer. He is not in the music business. He is not an actor. His name is Frank Lucas, and by his own account, he is the most powerful drug dealer in New York City. Years later, Lucas would call that coat the worst mistake of his life. He said it drew attention. He said a narcotics detective saw him on television, closer to the ring than half the celebrities in the arena, and started asking a simple question. Who is that man, and where does his money come from? That is the version Frank Lucas told. It is a good version. It has drama, a turning point, a single object that changes everything. The problem is that Frank Lucas told a lot of good versions of a lot of things, and the more you look at them, the harder it gets to find the line between the man and the performance. Because Frank Lucas did not just build a drug empire in Harlem, he built something rarer and more durable. He built a myth. And the myth worked so well that 40 years later, most people still believe it, even the parts that almost certainly never happened. This is not just a story about a drug dealer. It is a story about why America keeps choosing legends over facts, especially when the legend looks like a movie. Frank Lucas was born in LaGrange, North Carolina in 1930. Rural, black, poor. The kind of place where ambition had no obvious exit. By his own telling, he watched a cousin get murdered by the Ku Klux Klan when he was a child, and that moment burned out whatever trust he had in the world working the way it was supposed to. Whether the specific story is true is hard to confirm. What is certain is that Lucas left North Carolina as a young man and ended up in Harlem in the late 1950s, which is where every version of his story begins to grow a second layer. Harlem in the 50s was still running on the network Ellsworth Raymond Johnson had built. Most people called him Bumpy. He was the most prominent black crime figure in uptown Manhattan, a man who had negotiated a working relationship with the Italian families that controlled the city's underworld. Bumpy Johnson was not a kingpin the way movies would later define the word. He was a broker, a connector, a man who kept his piece of the pie by being useful to people more powerful than him. Frank Lucas would later say that he became Bumpy Johnson's right hand, his driver, his protege, his chosen successor. He described years of close mentorship, personal lessons in discipline and power, a passing of the torch from one generation to the next. The image is vivid, a young man from nowhere learning the rules of the game from a master. But the people who were actually around Bumpy Johnson in those years tell a different story. Some of them said Lucas was around, yes, but not in the inner circle, more like the edge, a runner, a presence, not the heir to anything. Bumpy Johnson died in 1968 at a restaurant, mid-sentence. He left no empire. He left a network that was already fraying, a set of relationships that depended on him being alive to maintain them. And Frank Lucas stepped into that vacuum not because he was chosen, but because it was empty. This matters because the myth of Frank Lucas begins with the idea that he was trained for the throne, that he inherited something and then made it bigger. The reality is closer to something less cinematic but more interesting. Lucas saw an opportunity in chaos, and he had the nerve to take it. That is not a fairy tale. That is a hostile takeover with no business plan. And the next part of the story, the part that made him famous, is where the line between what happened and what Lucas said happened gets almost impossible to trace. If you have ever heard of Frank Lucas, you have probably heard of the cadaver connection. The story goes like this. In the late 1960s and early 70s, Lucas traveled to Southeast Asia, specifically to the Golden Triangle region, where the borders of Thailand, Laos, and Myanmar meet. He made direct contact with heroin suppliers, cut out the Italian middlemen, and arranged to have the product smuggled back to the United States inside the coffins of American soldiers killed in Vietnam. Pure heroin, hidden inside the bodies of the dead, flying home on military transport planes. It is one of the most famous drug trafficking stories in American history. It has everything: audacity, horror, a kind of twisted genius, and it was the centerpiece of the 2007 film American Gangster, where Denzel Washington played Lucas, and the coffin scene became the emotional turning point of the movie. There is just one problem. The evidence for the cadaver connection is almost entirely Frank Lucas himself. If this kind of story grabs you, the kind where the version everyone remembers starts to crack the moment you push on it, subscribe to the channel, because the deeper you go into the Frank Lucas legend, the stranger the gap between fame and fact becomes. DEA agents who work the case have given mixed statements over the years. Some confirmed that Lucas had a Southeast Asian supply line. That part appears to be real. He did travel to Bangkok. He did make connections with suppliers closer to the source than most American dealers were operating at the time. But the coffin detail, the dead soldiers, the bodies stuffed with heroin, that specific claim has never been independently verified in a way that settles the question. Investigators have said the heroin may have come back in military cargo, in furniture, in shipping containers. Some of it may have been routed through military channels. But the image of drugs literally packed inside the corpses of American servicemen, the image that made the story unforgettable, rests on Lucas's word. And Lucas was a man who understood something most criminals never figure out. He understood that the story you tell about yourself is worth more than the thing you actually did. The cadaver connection did not need to be fully true to work. It needed to be too good not to repeat. And once it was repeated enough times, it became the version that mattered. This is where the matryoshka opens. You think this is a story about heroin. It is actually a story about narrative. About a man who figured out that if you give people a myth they want to believe, they will protect it for you, even when the facts start falling apart. What is not disputed is that Frank Lucas moved a lot of heroin through Harlem in the late 60s and early 70s. His product was branded. He called it Blue Magic, and it had a reputation for being purer than what the Italian-connected dealers were selling. Whether it was genuinely pure, or whether the branding just made people believe it was pure, is another question that gets murkier the closer you look. But the distribution model was real, and it was genuinely different. Lucas did not work through the traditional Harlem crews. He brought in his own people from North Carolina, brothers, cousins, nephews, childhood friends. He called them the country boys, and the name was not ironic. These were men from rural backroads who spoke with Southern accents, dressed conservatively, and did not fit the profile of New York street dealers. That was part of the advantage. They were invisible in a city that was looking for a different kind of criminal. The country boy system worked because it was closed. Outsiders could not get in. Trust was based on blood and hometown loyalty, not on negotiation or fear. At its peak, the operation was reportedly clearing about $1 million a day, though that figure, like most figures in the Frank Lucas story, was supplied by Frank Lucas. The economics of blue magic, as Lucas told them, sounded like a Harvard Business School case study, and that is not an accident. He described his operation as a vertical integration play. Go straight to the source, skip the middlemen, control quality, undercut the competition. In a legal industry, this would be called supply chain innovation. In the heroin trade, it was the same logic applied to a product that was destroying the community it moved through. And this is the part of the Frank Lucas myth that never gets enough scrutiny. Harlem in the early 70s was in crisis. Heroin was gutting neighborhoods block by block. Addiction rates were climbing. Overdose deaths were climbing. Crime tied to the drug economy was hollowing out the same black community that Frank Lucas came from. The country boys were not importing medicine. They were importing devastation on an industrial scale. And the profits went to a man who wore chinchilla to the Ali Frazier fight, while his customers died in hallways. The myth makes this easy to forget. The myth says Frank Lucas was a businessman, a rebel, a man who beat the system. The reality is that the system he beat was the immune system of his own neighborhood. But here is where it gets more complicated, because what brought Frank Lucas down was not guilt, and it was not karma. It was a specific kind of American law enforcement that was itself deeply corrupt. The investigation into Frank Lucas was led by a group of federal and local narcotics agents, most famously Richie Roberts, a New Jersey detective who would later become Lucas's defense attorney and, bizarrely, something close to a friend. Roberts was portrayed by Russell Crowe in American Gangster as a kind of moral compass, the honest cop in a sea of corruption. The real story is messier. Roberts was a real person who did real investigative work, but the film version smoothed out the complications. And the complications are the most important part. The cops who were supposed to be stopping the drug trade in Harlem were, in many cases, profiting from it. The Special Investigations Unit of the NYPD, the elite narcotics squad, was itself riddled with corruption. Officers were stealing drugs from evidence, reselling them, taking bribes from dealers, and protecting supply lines. The system Frank Lucas operated inside was not a system of law versus crime. It was a system where law and crime were often the same people, wearing different clothes. Lucas was arrested in 1975. Federal agents raided his home in Teaneck, New Jersey, and found cash, heroin, and weapons. He was convicted and sentenced to 70 years in prison. And then Frank Lucas did the thing that should have destroyed his legend forever, but somehow made it stronger. He became an informant. Lucas cooperated with federal prosecutors. He gave up names. Not a few names. By some accounts, over 100. Dealers, distributors, corrupt police officers, connections in the city and beyond. His testimony led to investigations, arrests, and convictions. In exchange, his sentence was reduced dramatically. He was out of prison by 1981. He went back in on a drug charge in the mid-'80s, cooperated again, and was released again in the early 90s. The man who built his entire empire on the loyalty of blood relatives, the man whose mythology depended on the idea that he was untouchable, unbreakable, and unbowed, saved himself by giving up everyone who had trusted him. Here is the question this story actually comes down to, and it is not the question you expected at the beginning. Was Frank Lucas a genuine innovator who changed the drug trade and then got caught by a broken system? Or was he a mid-level operator with a talent for self-promotion, who inflated his own story until it became bigger than anything he actually did? Drop your verdict in the comments, because both readings have evidence behind them, and the answer you choose says as much about you as it does about him. For a channel like this one, a real argument is worth more than 100 thumbs up. Because what happened after the trial is where the story stops being about crime and starts being about something else entirely. In 2000, a journalist named Mark Jacobson published a long article in New York Magazine. The piece was called "The Return of Superfly," and it was based almost entirely on interviews with Frank Lucas himself. Lucas was magnetic in those interviews. He talked about the Golden Triangle, the coffins, the $1 million days, the chinchilla coat. He talked about Bumpy Johnson like a beloved teacher. He talked about himself like a man who had lived a movie that Hollywood had not yet made. And Jacobson, to his credit, flagged contradictions. He noted places where Lucas's story did not line up with the public record. He quoted law enforcement sources who disputed key claims. But the structure of the piece, the voice, the pacing, gave Lucas exactly what Lucas wanted: a stage. Ridley Scott read the article and saw a film. Denzel Washington signed on, and in 2007, American Gangster turned Frank Lucas into a cultural icon. The film was not a documentary. It compressed timelines, invented scenes, combined real people into composite characters, and, most importantly, it made Frank Lucas the hero. Not the anti-hero, the hero. The man who went to war against the system and lost, but lost on his own terms. The cooperation, the informing, the 100+ names he gave to prosecutors, all of that was minimized. In the film, Lucas's decision to cooperate is framed as pragmatism, not betrayal. The devastation that heroin caused in Harlem is acknowledged but kept at a distance, like weather in the background of a love story. The audience leaves the theater remembering the chinchilla coat, the blue magic, the golden triangle, not the overdoses, not the informant file. And this is the deepest layer of the matryoshka. Frank Lucas did not just sell heroin. He sold a version of himself. Then a journalist bought it and resold it to a filmmaker. Then a filmmaker repackaged it and sold it to the world. At every stage, the story got cleaner, more cinematic, more mythic. And at every stage, the parts that complicated the myth, the informing, the disputed facts, the community devastation, got smaller. Lucas did not resist this process. He embraced it. He appeared at film premieres. He did interviews. He told the same stories he had been telling for decades, each time a little smoother, a little more polished. He was doing what he had always done, controlling the supply. Only now the product was not heroin. It was Frank Lucas. And America bought it. Because America has always had a weakness for the self-made outlaw. The man who comes from nothing, builds an empire through nerve and cunning, and refuses to apologize. It does not matter if the empire runs on someone else's suffering. It does not matter if the self-made part turns out to be self-told. The shape of the story is what matters, and Frank Lucas gave America a story shaped exactly like the one it wanted to hear. If what you want from a channel is stories that pull the myth apart and look at what is actually underneath, subscribe and hit the bell. Because every figure on this channel has a version the world remembers and a version the world chose to forget. But there is one more thing about that night at Madison Square Garden, and it is the thing that almost nobody talks about. Lucas said the chinchilla coat got him noticed. He said it was vanity, a lapse in judgment, the one moment where he let the flash override the discipline. It is a perfect anecdote. It has a moral. It has a cause and effect. One coat, one camera, one detective, one investigation, one downfall. But think about it differently. Frank Lucas did not have to wear that coat. He did not have to sit courtside. He did not have to be visible. A man who was truly disciplined, truly careful, truly running a covert operation worth millions, would not have walked into the most photographed event in the world, dressed like a man who wanted to be seen. Maybe the coat was not a mistake. Maybe the coat was the whole point. Maybe Frank Lucas was never really trying to be invisible. Maybe from the very beginning, what he wanted was not just the money or the power, but the story, the legend. The moment where a man from LaGrange, North Carolina, sits closer to the ring than Frank Sinatra, and the whole world has to wonder who he is. Frank Lucas died in 2019 in Cedar Grove, New Jersey. He was 88 years old. By then, the chinchilla was long gone. The blue magic was long gone. The country boys had scattered or gone to prison or died. Harlem had changed beyond recognition. But the legend was still growing, still being quoted, still being referenced in rap lyrics and true crime documentaries and YouTube videos, including this one. And somewhere in that legend is a man who understood, earlier and better than almost anyone, that in America, the story you tell about yourself will always travel further than the truth. The only question is what it leaves behind. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.